Welcome to The Deep Dive. We're the podcast where we take shared sources and, well, really dig into them to pull out key insights for you.
And maybe stir up a little thought along the way.
Absolutely. So today we're tackling Genesis. Specifically, we're zeroing in on some of the most, let's say, debated parts, the bits that have really sparked discussion over the centuries.
Right. And our goal here isn't to solve these debates, but to lay out the different viewpoints and complexities as they appear in the source material itself, neutrally.
It's amazing how many interpretations exist for some of these verses.
It really is. It shows how rich and layered these texts are. So let's get into it.
Okay, starting right at the very beginning, Genesis 1, verse 2. The earth is described as without shape and empty, and there's darkness over the surface of the watery deep. It's quite a picture.
It is. But, that's not the only way people have read that opening.
Oh, what's the alternative?
Well, some translations render the Hebrew phrase as, and the earth became, shapeless and empty.
Became. So that implies something happened between verse 1, in the beginning God created, and verse 2.
Exactly. This view suggests an original creation, then some kind of catastrophe or judgment that led to this chaotic state, then a recreation or restoration starting from that point.
Huh. But our source material brings up a grammatical point here, something about the Hebrew itself.
Yes, it does. It talks about the structure at the beginning of verse 2 being a disjunctive clause, not a vav consecutive.
Okay, break that down for us non-Hebrew scholars. Vav consecutive is like, and then.
Pretty much, yeah. It usually indicates the next thing in a sequence. A disjunctive clause, though, often sets the scene. It describes a state of affairs, a background condition, rather than the next event.
So grammatically, verse 2 might be describing the condition of the earth when God started the work described in verse 3, not necessarily what happened chronologically after verse 1.
That's the argument, yes. It suggests verse 2 is more like scene setting. Okay, here's the initial state, formless, empty, dark waters. Now let the creative acts begin.
It's interesting nuance. Okay, let's jump ahead to day 4. Genesis 1.16. God makes 2 great lights and the stars. Our source uses the term phenomenological language. What's that about?
It basically means describing things as they appear from the observer's perspective, from Earth.
So it's not necessarily saying the stars popped into existence only on day 4.
It might be saying that's when they became visible phenomena from Earth. Or perhaps when their function, like ruling day and night, was assigned. It's like how we talk about the sun rising and setting.
Even though we know the earth is moving.
Right, exactly. It's describing the appearance, the phenomenon.
And the source also flags the phrasing the greater light and the lesser light, not sun and moon. Why is that significant?
Well, the thinking is, in the surrounding ancient Near Eastern cultures, the sun and moon were often major deities with specific names.
Ah, so by avoiding those names.
By avoiding those names, the text might be deliberately demoting them, emphasizing they aren't gods to be worshipped, but just created things, serving a purpose assigned by the actual creator God. It avoids any hint of deification.
Makes sense. Okay, now for a really big one. Genesis 1.26. Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. That us and our, hugely debated.
Hugely. Our source runs through the main interpretations.
Like the Trinitarian view.
Yes, that's a major one, particularly in Christian tradition, seeing it as an early hint of the plurality within the Godhead, though, the full doctrine of the Trinity developed much later.
Right. What else? The plural of majesty, like a king saying, we decree.
That's been suggested.
Yeah.
But the source notes that this specific grammatical form, using we with a verb like that, isn't really how Hebrew works for royalty. It's not a strong parallel.
Okay. And the plural of deliberation, God talking to himself.
Another idea, yeah. But again, the source finds the examples often used to support this aren't quite convincing linguistically when compared to other ancient texts.
So if those are less likely, what does the source suggest fits the original context best?
It leans towards God speaking to or within his heavenly court.
The divine council, like we see in Job or Isaiah.
Exactly. The assembly of other divine beings, angels, that are often depicted around God in the Old Testament. In that ancient Near Eastern context, a high God presiding over a council was, well, a familiar concept.
So God is involving this heavenly council in the announcement.
Perhaps in the announcement, or maybe inviting them to witness or praise the act, like Job 38 suggests the morning stars sang together.
But the actual creating.
The source is clear on that. Verse 27 immediately follows. So God created humankind in his own image, singular. The actual creative act is attributed solely to God.
But if the U.S. includes the council, does that mean they also share the image in some way?
That's a fascinating implication the source raises. If they are part of the U.S., maybe the image isn't exclusively human. Perhaps it relates to shared roles like ruling or representing divine authority. It definitely opens up some complex theological territory.
Okay, let's look at Genesis 1.28, the command to subdue the earth. That word subdue can sound quite harsh today.
It can. And the source points out the Hebrew verb kabash can have strong meanings elsewhere, like enslave, conquer, even assault.
That doesn't sound like the Garden of Eden ideal.
No, it doesn't. And that's why the source argues those forceful meanings don't really fit the immediate context of Genesis 1 and 2, which is more about blessing and harmony.
So what's a better understanding here?
The general sense seems to be about bringing the earth under responsible management, making it productive, harnessing its potential for human life.
And the source gives ancient examples.
Yeah, things like farming, clearing land, building, mining, domesticating animals basically, exercising control over the environment to make it sustain you. Standard activities for survival and flourishing in that world.
All right, moving into Genesis 3, the serpent. Verse 1 says it was more crafty than any other wild animal. Many people automatically think Satan.
Right, that identification is very strong in later Jewish and Christian tradition and the New Testament. But the source stresses that within Genesis 3 itself, the text just presents it as an animal. A particularly clever one, but still one of God's creatures.
No explicit mention of Satan there?
Not in Genesis 3, no. The source even mentions some ancient Jewish interpretations, like in Jubilees, that suggested all animals could speak back then. Or Josephus, who thought the serpent acted out of simple jealousy.
Interesting historical perspectives. Now, the consequences in Genesis 3.16 for the woman, your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. That word desire is often debated.
Very much so. The common interpretation is sexual desire. But the source questions that.
Why?
Well, if it just meant sexual desire, how does that fit with the he will rule over you part?
Yeah.
It seems mismatched. And also, God already blessed them to be fruitful, so is sexual desire suddenly a curse?
Yeah.
It feels off.
So what's the alternative?
The source suggests it's more about a struggle for control, a desire to dominate or maybe manipulate within the relationship, which is now marred by sin.
And there's a connection to another verse.
Yes, Genesis 4.7. God warns Cain that sin's desire is for you, meaning sin wants to control him. It's the same Hebrew word for desire.
So using that parallel suggests the woman's desire in 3.16 might also be about this drive for control within the now fractured relationship.
That's the argument. It points towards relational conflict and power struggle as part of the curse, not just simple attraction.
Okay, chapter 4. Cain and Abel's offerings. Abel brings the firstborn and fat portions of his flock. Cain brings some of the produce. God accepts Abel's, not Cain's. Why the difference?
Well, the text itself in Genesis doesn't explicitly say why. That's part of the controversy.
No reason given.
Not directly. The source mentions traditional views focusing on the quality Abel brought his best, to the firstborn, the fat portions implying value. Cain just brought some produce, maybe suggesting less care or value.
A difference in attitude.
Potentially, yeah. Or perhaps a difference in the type of offering expected, though the text doesn't specify that either. The source also points to the New Testament interpretation in Hebrews.
What does Hebrews say?
Hebrews 11.4 says, Abel offered his sacrifice by faith, and that's why it was considered better. So it adds the theological layer, faith was the key difference.
Got it. Now, Genesis 6, the Nephilim. Always a source of fascination and confusion.
Definitely. Verse 4 mentions them. The meaning of Nephilim itself isn't totally clear. The text implies they result from unions between sons of God, whoever they are, and daughters of humankind.
But it doesn't explicitly state these unions produce the Nephilim.
Not quite that directly, but the connection is strongly implied by the context. They're described as mighty warriors of old, men of renown.
And who are the sons of God? Angels, fallen angels, human rulers.
That's the million-dollar question, really. All those interpretations exist. The text isn't specific.
And then there's the mention in Numbers.
Right. Our source points this out. In Numbers 13, the spies report seeing Nephilim in Canaan, calling them giants, and saying the Anakites are descended from them.
But wait, wasn't this after the flood, which supposedly wiped everyone out except Noah's family?
Exactly. That's the chronological puzzle. How could Nephilim exist both before and after the flood? Does Nephilim refer to a specific pre-flood group, or did it become a term for any large, intimidating people later on? The source leaves it pretty open. even noting parallels to other ancient myths about demigods.
Okay, staying in Genesis 6, verse 6. God regretted making humankind. That sounds problematic for an unchanging God.
It does raise questions, doesn't it? The source explains the Hebrew verb nakam is complex. It can mean to relent, change one's mind, be comforted, but also experience deep emotional pain or grief.
So it's not necessarily regret, like, oops, I made a mistake.
Probably not in that simple sense. Given the context of humanity's intense wickedness, the source interprets it here as God feeling profound sorrow, grief, heartache over how his creation turned out, an emotional response to the pain caused by sin.
That makes more sense. Now, Genesis 9, the Curse of Canaan. Ham sees his father Noah naked. Noah wakes up and curses Ham's son Canaan to be a slave. Seems disproportionate and misdirected.
It certainly seems that way on the surface. The source definitely flags this as a difficult passage. Why curse the son for the father's perceived offense and the severity lowest of slaves?
And this verse has had a terrible history.
A horrific history, yes. Used wrongly to justify slavery and racism for centuries. The source acknowledges the controversy, the questions about justice within the text, and the deeply problematic legacy of its interpretation.
Okay, Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. Everyone speaks one language. They decide to build a city and a tower to make a name for ourselves. God steps in, confuses the language, scatters them.
A classic story. The source points out its function in the narrative.
Which is?
It serves as an explanation, an etiology for why there are so many languages and why people are spread across the earth. Interestingly, it comes after chapter 10, which lists all the nations and languages already.
So the effect is described, then the cause.
Exactly. It's a common narrative technique. First the what, diverse nations, then the why, Babel.
And there's that plural again. God says, come, let us go down.
Yes, just like in Genesis 1.26. Again, the source notes interpretations like God speaking to his heavenly council before taking action.
Okay, the source then shifts to patterns of, let's say, ethically complex behavior from the patriarchs, starting with Abram lying about Sarah being his sister. Twice.
Right, to Pharaoh in Egypt and later to Abimelech. He says he did it out of fear for his life.
Understandable fear, maybe, but the ethics?
That's the controversy the source highlights. Does self-preservation justify deception, especially when it potentially endangers someone else, in this case his wife? It raises sticky moral questions.
Then there's Lot and his daughters in Genesis 19. After Sodom's destruction, they think they're the only ones left, get Lot drunk, and conceive children with him.
Very unsettling story. Their stated motive is to preserve the family line.
And the children born are Moab and Ben-Ami, ancestors of the Moabites and Ammonites,
who are often rivals or enemies of Israel. The source suggests this rather shocking origin story might serve, well, a polemical purpose, casting these neighboring nations in a negative light from their very beginning.
Moving to Jacob. First, buying Esau's birthright for a bowl of stew when Esau was starving.
Exploiting his brother's desperation, essentially.
And then the big one. Deceiving the blind, elderly Isaac with Rebekah's help to steal the blessing meant for Esau.
Yeah, a multi-layered deception. The source really emphasizes the ethical questions here. Is the blessing valid if obtained through lies and manipulation? How do we reconcile this with Jacob being God's chosen one? It's deeply uncomfortable.
And Rachel stealing Laban's household idols, the teraphim in Genesis 31, what was that about?
We don't know for sure why she took them. The source admits the significance is unclear. Were they religious items? Symbols of inheritance rights? Good luck charms?
But Laban wanted them back badly.
Very badly. He chases after them. Whatever they were, they clearly had value. And Rachel's act of theft, whatever her motive may be, spite, maybe trying to secure inheritance, maybe something else, is another ethically dubious moment.
Then Jacob wrestling with the mysterious man all night in Genesis 32. Who was that?
Another enduring mystery. The text just says a man. Interpretations range from an angel to God himself to something else entirely. The source highlights this ambiguity.
And Jacob leaves, changed, injured, but with a new name, Israel.
Right. It's clearly a pivotal transformative event, but its exact nature remains debated. What did it truly signify?
Okay, Genesis 34, the violation of Dinah, Jacob's daughter, and the absolutely brutal revenge by her brothers, Simeon and Levi.
They trick the men of Shechem into getting circumcised while supposedly negotiating Dinah's marriage, and then slaughter them all when they're vulnerable.
It's horrific. What's the controversial element the source points to?
It's the sheer brutality and deceit of the revenge. While their anger over Dinah is presented as understandable, their method is condemned, even by Jacob later on. It raises questions about justice versus disproportionate vengeance.
Then Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, sleeping with Bilhah, his father's concubine, in Genesis 35.
A major taboo. The source points out this was seen as a direct challenge to his father's authority and honor.
And it cost him dearly, didn't it?
It did. Jacob brings it up on his deathbed in Genesis 49, and Reuben loses the privileges of the firstborn because of it. A clear consequence for a serious transgression.
And finally, Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38, a very complex story. Tamar disguises herself as a prostitute to trick her father-in-law, Judah, into fulfilling his obligation to provide her with offspring after he failed to do so.
It's a narrative full of moral gray areas. Tamar uses deception, yes, but Judah had wronged her by neglecting his duty according to the customs of the time, the levirate marriage law.
So who's right and who's wrong?
That's the complexity the source highlights. It's not simple. Judah himself ends up acknowledging that Tamar was more righteous than I. Her questionable means were arguably aimed at securing justice and lineage that were rightfully hers.
Wow. So looking back across all these points, from creation ambiguities to patriarchal failings, it's really clear Genesis doesn't shy away from difficult, controversial material.
Not at all. These aren't neat, simple stories with easy heroes and villains, are they? They present raw human behavior, complex divine actions, and situations that have provoked debate for literally millennia.
And that's perhaps why they remain so compelling. They force you to think, to wrestle with the text.
Exactly. They invite deeper reflection on human nature, on God, on ethics, on how we even read and interpret ancient writings.
So we really encourage you, the listener, to go back to Genesis, maybe reread some of these sections with these different interpretations and controversies in mind. Keep asking questions.
Just keep exploring.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Considering this huge range of interpretation, this constant wrestling with the text over centuries, what does that tell us about how we engage with foundational stories that raise such profound and often uncomfortable questions today?
Something to ponder, definitely.